Welcome to an American Catechism by Stab the Dragon Productions. Episode number, 42, 43 maybe, somewhere in there. Coming to you from Fort Worth, Texas on Sunday, December 28th, 2025, where it is 81 degrees. Today we're getting back to part 3 of our studies of the Vikings as part of our Americanology studies. The two previous episodes of Viking studies were answering a couple of basic questions primarily. One, why study Vikings as part of American history? And then also, what have historians in America done with the Vikings in their general survey books of American history? To sum it up so far, I think a thorough study of Americanology should include more about the Vikings because of the deep roots of today's Western civilization, which produced the American experiment, were significantly and dramatically affected by the Vikings. To understand who we are today, we need more of an understanding of the Vikings than most textbooks provide. And if you look at how sick American and Western civilization have become, we need a return of some of our Viking vigor to our culture. And to go along with today's Viking study, I will actually be drinking a beer imported from Iceland. This is Einstök Wee Heavy. This is a Scottish ale smoked with Icelandic barley that's smoked in Iceland. There you go. Who were these Vikings who discovered America, first of all? Today's Scandinavians may sometimes look back at their Viking ancestors and the times in which they roamed the seas as the golden age for their people. Seriously. Does anyone fear being invaded by the Danes today or the Swedes? Is Norway on anybody's top 20 most dangerous countries list? No, but the United States does consider all three of these countries as valuable allies, especially in a time of war in Europe. And be it noted that Turkey objected to Sweden joining NATO for reasons they claimed involved terrorists on some list or something. But yes, the Vikings did participate in the Crusades on the side of the Christians against the Turks. But that was 1,000 years ago. The Viking age varies a bit according to whichever scholar's writing on the subject, but generally it can be thought of as roughly from about 789 to 1100, a bit over 300 years. But the Vikings did not just arrive out of nowhere. Like any people group, they came from a long, obscure past, and we're trying to piece together that past. Before we look at their ancient past, let's look at the geography of Scandinavia and Northern Europe, because geography and climate helped form the Vikings as it does any people. From the northern tip of Norway, bordering the Arctic Ocean and Russia, to the southern edge of Denmark, bordering Germany, Scandinavia is about a half the length of Europe from north to south, or approximately 1,150 miles. Large portions of Norway and Sweden lie inside the Arctic Circle, and their sphere of influence lies from the border with Russia to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. While Norway is the furthest north, their coastline actually has a milder climate than you would think, because of the warm Gulf Stream waters that flow all the way from Texas and the Gulf of America to Norway. The mountainous interiors of Norway and Sweden are very cold and rugged, but Denmark is much milder and does not have the mountains that their northern neighbors do. Its highest elevation is only about 560 feet, while the highest mountain in Norway is about 8,100 feet. Oslo, Norway, the capital, is at about 60 degrees north latitude, which compares with Anchorage, Alaska, at about 61 degrees. Copenhagen, Denmark, the capital, is at about 55 degrees north, compares to Seattle, Washington State, at 47.6 degrees north. Scandinavia has very short days in the winter and very long days in the summer. One of the oddities about Scandinavia and the end of the Ice Age and today is the shoreline. Now, one would think that with the rising waters of the ocean, due to the melting of mile-high glaciers, the Scandinavian landmass would have lost a lot of shoreline as the oceans rose. However, as the ice melted, the weight of the glaciers decreased over time, and the crust of the earth has rebounded and actually risen substantially, thus somewhat keeping pace with the rising sea levels. Rosedal writes, there have obviously been changes in the physical appearance of Scandinavia since the Viking Age. The land has risen considerably above sea level in some places. Now, I'll be referring to Rosedal throughout this talk. I've done a review of her book right here, The Vikings, and that review was, I don't know, three years ago or so. So it is on my YouTube list there. Norway only has about 3% arable land available for farming. Sweden has 6%, while Denmark has 50 to 60%. Because of the mountains in Norway and Sweden and the rugged coastlines with long, deep fjords, the easiest form of travel for Scandinavians was by boat. Land travel became easier in the winter when snow and ice covered the land, and the many lakes were frozen, so skis and sleds would be used. Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, is on an island. Sweden and Norway have the most islands of any nations in the world, and that kind of surprised me. And I double-checked that because I was kind of thinking Indonesia, the Philippines, even Greece, but that's the answer I came up with. But the net result is their geography made the Scandinavians a seafaring people, much like the ancient Greeks, whose mountainous land and hundreds of islands with little arable soil made them adventurous seafarers as well. The word Viking may come from the noun vik, which is like a cove or a bay where they would beach their ships. And then there's a verb, Viking, that means to go raiding or pirating. A Viking is a Vikinger, one who is away from home going Viking from a Vik. That's how the word plays out. In medieval Russia, the Swedish Vikings who ruled for a while, that's right, the Swedes ruled Russia, they were called Rus. The Swedes were the Rus, and their empire became Russia. And so the Russians today don't like talking about that part of their ancient history. I'm just telling you. Old English used the term, well, it's spelled with a W, but I'm sure it's pronounced V, Viking, for pirate or raider. Viking. The rest of the world called the Vikings the Northmen, men from the north, the Norse, the Normans, the Danes, Varangians, heathens, pagans, or simply barbarians. Scandinavia was the last portion of Europe to emerge from the glaciers of the Ice Age, and hunter-gatherers gradually moved in following the herds of reindeer and other large mammals. Agriculture may have started by 4000 BC, as well as animal husbandry, but hunting and fishing remained crucial. By about 1700 BC, the Bronze Age was arriving in Scandinavia, and Germanic peoples began to move in. Scandinavians, Germans, and Anglo-Saxons are all related. They're all Germanic peoples. So they're essentially the same people group who over time, developed separate languages and customs, but they're cousins. Scandinavians had furs and amber. Okay, I've got, some people don't really know what amber is. So I have some examples of amber here that I'm sure this is not ancient amber because this was very inexpensive. I'm sure this is industrialized, prefabbed, chemically made amber, but nonetheless it is available. And it is interesting because, you can make genuine amber. It is the tree resin of certain pine trees that is hardened over time. And the amber that was particularly amazing from the ancient days was amber that encapsulates ancient bugs or lizards or whatever. And so you can actually study ancient life forms by looking at the amber. So here you've got obviously, fabricated forms of amber, but I'm sure it's still the real tree resin. I mean, it says it's genuine amber. And it hardens, so it's kind of like a precious stone or gem. In the ancient days, these were very valuable. Okay, and so it was like finding diamonds, and the trade in amber, and the amber concentrated along the Baltic Sea coast. I mean, that's just where most amber in the world was from at the time. And so it was highly prized, a much sought after luxury good, right? But the Scandinavians also had furs, which again were highly prized, whalebone and ivory from walruses, and they would carve things with those. And so they would take these luxury goods that had high value and trade with other peoples. And so that's how one way the Vikings got rich. The oldest written sources that we have about Scandinavia are quotes by ancient writers, particularly the Greek geographer Pytheas, whose book Of the Ocean was lost to the ravages of time, but portions of it did survive, and there were, quotes from it or quotes about it. And I've done another book review of The Extraordinary Voyage of Pytheas the Greek by Cunliffe several years ago. And that was Stab the Dragon number 112. But in that book, Pytheas journeys from Massalia, Marseille, France today, on the Mediterranean coast to Britain, where tin is sourced from, and then from there to Scandinavia and probably as far as Iceland. And the quotes from Pytheas tell us a lot about the land and its people, including their drink of choice, mead, made from grain and honey. And here is a local mead that's got a Viking theme. This is produced here in Fort Worth, All Father. And I will do a review from B and Brew, or the makers of this, B and Brew in Fort Worth, Texas. And this is a fig and honey mead. And it's interesting. I don't know much about mead, but I'll probably do a review of that at some point in the future. But that was known as the Vikings' drink of choice, because obviously they couldn't grow grapes that far north. But also, we understand a lot of the Vikings from archaeology, because there was not much writing by the Vikings. They had a rune script that gives some information, but not much. So Viking literacy came late. It came after their conversion to Christianity. So what you have to deal with is archaeology primarily. You don't have many written sources other than outsiders writing about what they see, or Scandinavians writing about things hundreds of years after the Viking Age. And so that makes the study of Vikings heavily dependent on archaeology. But Pytheas viewed the aurora borealis, and so that was something as well. He talked about their ability to farm so far north, and their grain and their honey. So there's quite a bit of interesting stuff about the Vikings from the ancients, but just not as much as a literate civilization. So what can we briefly say about Viking society and culture? In discussing Viking society, Elsa Rosedal does not hesitate to discuss slavery. Like almost every other culture on Earth, the Vikings practiced slavery. She writes, "The purpose of many Viking expeditions was no doubt to capture slaves. The warriors might keep them, sell them, or possibly exchange them for a ransom from rich relatives or from the Christian church, which was opposed on principle to Christians being slaves of pagans. The ransoming of Christian captives as an act of piety is frequently mentioned in the accounts of the conversion of Scandinavia. The author tells us that some graves tell the story that as a master died, a slave would be killed to be buried with the master. So notice to all, the practice of slavery occurred many centuries before America was a nation or the Confederacy acquired slaves. Slavery was a worldwide practice, and with the Vikings, it was white-on-white slavery. Our word for slave, in fact, comes to us from the word for the ethnic group Slavs in Eastern Europe because the Vikings captured so many Slavs and sold them to the Turks. There you go. So Slavs and slaves became synonymous, and they were all white. In discussing women, sexual roles, and children, Rosedal writes, given the importance of the family unit, consisting of father, mother, spouse, and siblings, in Viking society it is not surprising that the largest and most splendid runic monuments mention women. And we learn that while women accompanied the large Viking armies that fought in England and France, there is scant evidence of women Viking warriors, much to the disappointment of modern movie makers. Rosedal does not present any evidence for gay, lesbian, or trans Vikings, I'm sure to the disappointment of the LGBTQ alphabet community. Maybe it was the extreme cold, perhaps the long sea voyages, or the nature of pagan medieval life in general. But homosexuality is a sin common to the human race, stretching back at least as far as Genesis 9 and the sin of Ham. And I'm sure that there are some papers and articles out there about Vikings and homosexuality if you want to go there. Rosedal's book has a very good chapter on the old and new religion, where she discusses the paganism of Viking society and the changes that brought Christianity into that society. But of course, the difficulties of studying Old Norse religions are that virtually all documentary evidence about the pre-Christian religion in Scandinavia was written by Christians, and the fullest accounts were written several centuries after their conversion. So here's an account of a Viking funeral written by a Muslim Arab envoy, Ibn Fadlan, Fadlan, I guess, on the Volga River. He writes, when a chieftain dies, slaves and servants are asked who will die with him. The one who volunteers cannot alter the decision. In this particular case, it was a woman who was treated with great courtesy while the burial was being prepared. The woman who was die went round to each tent in the camp and had sexual intercourse with its owner. After this, she performed various other rituals and was finally taken into the tent to her dead master. 6 men followed her into the tent and had sexual intercourse with her, and then she was killed. Nice. Eventually, Christianity replaced the pagan religions of Scandinavia, but the introduction of Christianity caused a cultural divide everywhere. It brought not only new rituals and a new faith, but also a change in the moral code and a gradual erosion of deep-rooted cultural patterns. And we'll study more about the conversion of Scandinavia later on. But I find it noteworthy that Rosedal notices that Christianity does cause a cultural divide. And Jesus had said, do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Matthew 10:34-36. Studying these kinds of cultural changes that result from adopting Christianity is an important part of Americanology. The political world of Scandinavians changes significantly throughout the Viking Age. At the beginning of the age, the Vikings were not centralized around kings of countries. But by the end of the age, there were kings, dynasties, and 3 distinct Scandinavian countries were somewhat formed and coherent. This process of forming organized states paralleled the conversion from paganism to Christianity. Again, we'll look at more of that later and how it ties in with the discovery of America, because there is a link there. At the start of the Viking Age, the kings were local chieftains who had proved their leadership with their abilities at war, seafaring, capturing wealth, and sharing that wealth. Viking chieftains held the loyalty of their followers based on their physical strength, their courage, success, and generosity. Since there were no cities and few towns, and not even many villages, the Scandinavians lived primarily in scattered homesteads and farms. The population density was quite low, a very different social setup from that in the main countries of Europe during the Middle Ages, so centralized authority was not really a part of their society well into the Viking Age. Local chieftains could gather up their followers and decide to go on a Viking raid with just a few ships and crew. A typical Viking longboat might have 25 to 50 men on board, so if they had 2 to 5 ships, there could be 50 to a couple of hundred on a Viking raid, which would be plenty enough to attack an isolated monastery or two. Or, if the emphasis was on trade, that would be a well-protected trading party. But the further we get into the Viking Age, the more often we find large armies of Vikings numbering in the thousands, invading England, France, Ireland. Large armies required central planning, supplies, coordination, and authority, which brings about the need for kings. So how did the Vikings govern themselves? The Vikings held regular assemblies of free men at 2 to 3 different levels. At a district level, think about the size, not population, of a small county or large town in America. The free men would get together at what would be called, translated, the district thing, or even the all thing, meaning all men were to be there. At these things, they would discuss laws, try cases, settle disputes, free slaves, plan business like Viking rigs, etc. The next level up would consist of representatives from the district things to the regional things, where the next level of politics was conducted. There were also grand social events with gifts being given, feasts being made, and pagan sacrifices. This describes a very crude democracy of sorts, which was common in Germanic peoples. And that's why when I describe Western civilization, I talk about the Greeks, the Romans, the Jews, the Christians, but also the Germanic peoples, which includes the Germanic tribes, the Scandinavians, the Anglo-Saxons, and even the Franks. In future episodes of the Vikings, I will look at how wide their influence was, the lands that they explored and conquered, their conversion to Christianity, their participation in the Crusades, and of course their discovery of Vinland, or America. Well, that does it for this episode of American Catechism. In signo Winkies, out here.